The county inspector stood at the edge of my barn with a folder of old blueprints in his hands, looking at me like he wasn't sure how to say what he'd just found. I remember the exact moment, because it was the first time in 11 months of dealing with the Meadowcrest Farms Homeowners Association that I felt the ground actually shift underneath somebody other than me. "Mr. Halloway," he said, "you're going to want to sit down for this one. My name is Grady Halloway. I'm 56 years old, and I've kept horses and a little hay ground on this property for over 20 years. Ever since I bought it as a rundown 40 acres with a collapsing barn, and rebuilt the whole thing board by board over 3 summers, mostly with my own 2 hands and a lot of help from my late wife's brother, who still teases me about the summer we spent arguing over rafter angles. That barn has stood in the exact same spot for 18 years now. It's a big structure, weathered gray wood, a loft full of hay, stalls for 6 horses along the back wall, and a wide dirt floor down the center aisle where I've spent more early mornings than I can count. It never once occurred to me, not for a single day of those 18 years, that the ground underneath it might matter to anybody besides me and the horses standing on it. Then Meadowcrest Farms estates went up on the ridge above my property line, and about 2 years after the last house sold, a woman named Vivian Truex became president of the Homeowners Association, and my barn suddenly became the single most important structure in her entire world. I want to explain how this whole mess started, because it didn't begin with blueprints or county inspectors. It began, the way most of these things seem to, with a letter. The letter arrived on Meadowcrest Farms' letterhead, informing me that my barn's roofline exceeded what the association's newly adopted design guidelines called an acceptable visual height for structures within. And I remember this phrase specifically, the community's scenic viewshed corridor. I read that letter twice at my kitchen table, and then read it a 3rd time out loud to my brother-in-law, Roy, just to make sure I hadn't misunderstood something. "Your barn's been standing there since before their subdivision existed," Roy said. "How exactly does it violate a viewshed corridor that didn't exist when you built it?" I called the number on the letter and got Vivian Truax herself, who explained, in the calm and practiced tone of someone who'd clearly rehearsed the conversation before I ever picked up the phone, that the association's design review committee had recently completed what she called a comprehensive scenic assessment, and that several older structures on adjacent properties, mine included, had been flagged for what she termed voluntary remediation discussions. "My barn isn't part of your association," I told her. "It's not on your side of the property line, and it was here 14 years before the first house in Meadowcrest ever broke ground." "We understand it predates the community," she said smoothly, "but property values in Meadowcrest depend significantly on the surrounding scenic character, and we'd very much like to work with you on a mutually beneficial solution." Mutually beneficial. I'd learn over the following months that Vivian used that phrase the way some people use a hammer, swinging it at every conversation regardless of whether it actually fit. The letters kept coming after that, roughly every 3 weeks, each one a little more pointed than the last. One suggested that a reduced roofline or a repositioned structure might resolve the association's concerns. Another mentioned, almost in passing, that continued non-cooperation could affect what it called neighborhood relations going forward, a phrase vague enough that I couldn't quite pin down whether it was a threat or just corporate-sounding nonsense, though I had my suspicions. I ignored most of them, because my barn sat entirely on my own land, built under a county permit I still had filed away in a drawer, and no homeowners association had any legal standing over property that had never belonged to their subdivision in the first place. I figured Vivian would eventually lose interest and move on to harassing somebody who actually lived inside her jurisdiction. She didn't. If anything, she escalated. About 4 months into the letters, a survey crew showed up along the shared boundary line between my property and the nearest Meadowcrest lot, running string lines and taking measurements that seemed to focus, oddly enough, almost entirely on the southeast corner of my barn. I watched them from my porch for the better part of an hour before I finally walked over and asked what exactly they were surveying. HOA hired us to document existing structures near the community boundary, one of the crew members told me, not unkindly. Something about an old access easement they're trying to locate. That was the first time I heard the phrase access easement in connection with my barn, and I want to be honest and say it didn't mean much to me at the time. I filed it away as one more piece of HOA nonsense and went back to my morning chores. I should have paid closer attention. That phrase turned out to be the whole story. It was my neighbor, a retired county road maintenance supervisor named Earl Prout, who'd lived on the other side of the ridge for nearly 40 years, who first mentioned something that made me start paying real attention. I ran into Earl at the feed store one Saturday and mentioned, mostly as a way of venting, the ongoing saga with Vivian Truax and her Scenic viewshed letters. Earl went quiet for a second, then set down the bag of feed he was carrying. You know your barn sits right where the old Meadowcrest emergency access route was supposed to go, don't you? I told him I had no idea what he was talking about. Back when that development first got approved, Earl said. Must be going on 23 years now. The county fire marshal required a secondary emergency access road for the whole subdivision. Only one main entrance off the county highway back then. And fire code wouldn't approve that many homes without a second way in and out in case of a wildfire or a blocked road. The developer platted a secondary access easement running down through the low ground along the creek, straight through what was then just open pasture. That's my property, I said slowly. Was open pasture when the plat got recorded, Earl said. Belonged to the Hendricks family back then, before you bought it. County approved the whole Meadowcrest development contingent on that emergency access easement staying clear and usable. Then old man Hendricks sold off the parcel to you a couple years later. And I always figured somebody along the way handled the paperwork to either build that road or release the easement properly. Guess maybe they didn't. I stood there in the middle of the feed store parking lot doing some uncomfortable math in my head. The same kind of math Marcus Whitfield had described doing months earlier in an entirely different HOA dispute. Except this time, it was my own barn sitting squarely in the middle of the equation. I drove straight to the county planning office that same afternoon, and a records clerk named Denise pulled the original Meadowcrest Farms Estates development file for me, a thick folder going back over 2 decades. Sure enough, buried about halfway through, was the original fire marshal's approval letter, conditioning the entire subdivision's occupancy permits on the permanent maintenance of a secondary emergency access route, platted along the creek bottom exactly where Earl had described it. The plat map attached to that file showed the easement running in a wide, clear strip, 30 feet across, extending from the county highway, along the low ground, straight through the parcel that would later become my 40 acres, and connecting to Meadowcrest's rear boundary road. My barn sat almost entirely inside that 30-foot corridor. I asked Denise whether the easement had ever been formally released or relocated. She spent nearly 20 minutes searching before coming back with an answer that made my stomach tighten. There's no release on file, she said. No relocation approval either. As far as county records show, that emergency access easement is still active. It's still a condition of Meadowcrest's original occupancy approval. I sat with that for a long moment. So what happens if it's still active and there's a barn sitting in the middle of it? Denise looked almost apologetic. Technically speaking, Meadowcrest Farms Estates has been out of compliance with its own occupancy conditions for however long that barn's been standing there, because the required emergency access isn't clear and usable the way the fire marshal originally mandated. I called an attorney the next morning, a methodical man named Perry Andrada who'd handled land use and easement matters for longer than I'd owned my barn. He spent nearly a week reviewing everything: the original plat, the fire marshal's letter, the county's occupancy records for Meadowcrest, before he called me back with an assessment that reframed the entire situation in a way I hadn't fully considered. Here's the interesting part, Perry said. You're not actually the one out of compliance here, Grady. Your barn sits on private property you own outright, built under a valid permit, on land that was open pasture at the time the easement was platted. The obligation to maintain that access clear and usable falls on the parties who benefit from it, meaning the subdivision, not on you. So Vivian's whole Scenic viewshed campaign, I said slowly, was almost certainly her trying to quietly pressure you into tearing down or relocating a structure that's sitting on an emergency easement she either just discovered or has known about for a while, Perry said, rather than approach you honestly about an old access easement and negotiate its release or relocation properly, which would have cost the HOA money and required your cooperation. It looks like somebody decided it would be easier to harass you into moving the barn voluntarily under an entirely unrelated pretext. I thought back through 11 months of letters about roofline height and scenic corridors, not one of which had ever once mentioned the words emergency access or easement. Why wouldn't she just tell me the truth from the beginning? I asked. Perry was quiet for a second. My honest guess is that once she found out the barn was sitting on an active easement Meadowcrest never properly cleared or relocated, she realized the subdivision itself has been technically out of compliance with its own occupancy conditions this entire time. That's not exactly the kind of thing an HOA president wants surfacing in front of her own board, let alone the county fire marshal's office. I want to be clear that I never set out to punish an entire neighborhood over one person's decision to handle things dishonestly. My barn had been standing peacefully for 18 years, and I had no interest in tearing it down or relocating 6-horse stalls over a paperwork problem that wasn't mine to begin with. What I wanted was simple. I wanted Vivian Truex to stop sending me letters about scenic corridors and start being honest about what she actually knew. So Perry drafted a letter of his own, addressed not to Vivian personally, but to the full Meadowcrest Farms Homeowners Association Board, laying out the history of the emergency access easement, the fire marshal's original occupancy condition, and a formal request that the association either arrange a proper relocation of the easement through legitimate legal channels, with appropriate compensation for the burden it had placed on my property for over 2 decades, or publicly acknowledge that the subdivision's occupancy permits rested on an access route that had never been properly maintained. That letter went out on a Tuesday. By Thursday, the county fire marshal's office had somehow, through channels neither Perry nor I ever fully traced back to their source, received an anonymous inquiry asking them to review Meadowcrest Farms estate's current emergency access compliance status. I never sent that inquiry myself, and Perry swore up and down he hadn't either. To this day, I have my suspicions it came from somewhere inside the HOA's own board. Somebody who'd started asking uncomfortable questions once word of Perry's letter began circulating. The county inspector who eventually showed up at my barn that day, the one who told me to sit down before he explained what he'd found, turned out to already have most of the picture assembled from his own review of the file. He'd cross-referenced the original plat, confirmed the easement had never been legally released, and walked the boundary himself with a copy of the original survey in hand. "The good news for you, Mr. Holloway," he said, "is that this isn't your problem to fix. You own this land free and clear, and nothing in the original conditions requires you personally to do anything. The bad news is for Meadowcrest. Their occupancy permits have technically been out of compliance with the fire marshal's original conditions for as long as this barn has been standing here. And that's the kind of finding that doesn't just quietly go away once it's been formally documented." Meadowcrest called an emergency board meeting less than 2 weeks later, and word of it had spread through the neighborhood fast enough that the clubhouse was standing room only by the time it started. I attended, mostly at Perry's suggestion, sitting near the back with a folder of my own documentation in case anyone tried to reframe the story in a way that put the blame back on me. Vivian opened the meeting attempting to characterize the entire situation as an unfortunate historical oversight that the board was, quote, actively working to resolve in the best interest of the community. A board member I didn't recognize, a soft-spoken man named Desmond Ockhaffer, asked the question that seemed to unravel the rest of her framing entirely. "How long have you known about the easement, Vivian?" She hesitated just long enough for the room to notice. The Design Review Committee identified some historical documentation several months ago, she said carefully. Several months, Desmond repeated. And instead of bringing it to the board, you sent Mr. Halloway 11 months of letters about roofline height and scenic corridors, none of which ever mentioned an emergency easement. The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when everyone present has just started doing the same uncomfortable math at the same time. What came out over the following weeks, once the county fire marshal's office formally opened its own compliance review, was that Vivian had indeed discovered the easement issue nearly a year earlier, during exactly the Design Review Committee assessment she'd mentioned, and had made a deliberate decision to pursue quiet pressure on me to relocate my barn voluntarily, rather than disclose the compliance problem to her own board or to the county, likely because a formal, honest process would have required the HOA to pay for either relocating the easement or securing my cooperation through proper compensation, either of which would have cost money and required board approval she apparently didn't want to seek. The board voted to remove her from the presidency within the month, and the association ultimately worked with Perry's office to negotiate a formal, compensated relocation of the emergency access route along the northern edge of my property instead. A stretch of ground far enough from my barn that it required no changes to my property at all, funded entirely by the HOA, and completed under proper county permits within the year. I never did have to move so much as a single board of that barn. The horses never noticed a thing had changed, though I did tell my brother-in-law Roy the whole story over a couple of beers one evening, and he laughed harder than I'd seen him laugh in years when I got to the part about Vivian's scenic viewshed corridor. 20 years of arguing about roof angles, he said, and it turns out the real problem was 30 feet of buried paperwork the whole time. I think about that sometimes, standing in my barn in the early mornings the way I always have, hay dust drifting through the light from the east-facing window. It never occurred to me for 18 years that the ground under my boots might matter to anybody but me. It turns out it mattered a great deal to an entire subdivision, and to one woman who decided the easiest way to handle an inconvenient truth was to bury it under 11 months of letters about something else entirely, rather than simply telling me what she already knew.